Alright guys, so to get us set off here, so this will be the reading for next week. I want to get that out of the way so you guys have that information first and foremost. The first story that we're going to be reading for Monday, so you need to have this read by the time the lecture quizzes go up on Monday and before they finish on Tuesday. So you have a little bit more time, you have about 4 days, to get through for The Hunger Artist and The Message from the Emperor by Franz Kafka. So that's the thing for Monday. For Wednesday, we're going to have the first part of the poem, The Wasteland, Burial of the Dead. Burial of the Dead is the part, that's not the whole name of the poem. The poem is The Wasteland's first part, The Burial of the Dead. And for Friday, have a little bit more break because these are going to be pretty heavy-handed, I'm not going to lie. I'm trying to find more light things that are also really good, but just bear with me on that. But this is the thing we're going to be doing for Friday, which is the issue of the Sandman comic by Neil Gaiman, The Dollhouse Part 4. And for all of these, as always, I will provide PDFs or Word documents for all of them. You guys do not need to find anything. I should have all of them up by the time this lecture airs on Friday, at the very least on Saturday, but I wouldn't count on it. It should be no later than Friday evening for all of these, all the things that we need to do for next week, reading-wise. All right, so, but that's next week did and done. Let's go ahead and fast forward to the Library of Babel. So one of the things that is important to realize about the story is it doesn't function like a normal story. There's a lot of weird things going on. It doesn't have, someone goes on an adventure and a quest and goes and gets something, and of course, obviously that's not every story, but it's interesting to note that that seems to be what this author has already done. He mentions on page 112, like all men of the library, in my younger days I traveled. So he's already gone out and done things. This is almost an epistolary. It's a record. It's him writing down an account of everything that he's done. He's already done it. Now he just has to tell us about it. But he traveled where? Because space and how big the Library of Babel is important to the story. So we have some brief illustrations here. Yeah, I know they're not great. But for what's going on here, it's important to understand the scope of what the library looks like. Because he says it's infinite and vast, and well, we maybe have a ballpark understanding of what that is. I have some numbers here to help us put that in context. Don't worry, we won't spend forever on them because this isn't a math class and not a philosophy class, although there is a lot of both of those things going on in this story. The first one is just to get a better understanding of what the library looks like. It's all in hexagonal rooms that you have the various passageways that goes off to the side to other hexagons. You have the living quarters and like a pantry, things for food and whatnot. But the important thing and the central focus of the story is all the books that are in the library. So they have, of the two sides of the hexagons that are the entrances and exits, respectively, for each of the hexagons, you also have 4 bookshelves with 5. You have 4 walls with 5 bookshelves on each of them. Each bookshelf has 32 books, and each book has 410 pages, with 40 lines on each page, and around 80-ish letters / symbols per each one of those. Now, what does that add up to? So, for each book, there is a possible so the number of letters in total for that book, so the number of how unique it is or how different it is from everything else, is there a total for any given book, 1,312,000 even number of symbols inside each of the books. There's a terrible arrow. Oh gosh. Oh wow. This is. So that's there. But this is the number of symbols that are in a possible book. Now, if the library is one of the things we'll get onto here in a minute, when we get to kind of like how it becomes more metaphysically concerned with what the story does. The number of combinations that is in this can be represented by writing the number out again. 0, 0, 0, and then an exclamation mark at the end. That's a factorial, and we won't spend forever on that, but a factorial is really useful for figuring out the number of combinations within a given number. And what it is, essentially, is this is just shorthand. The exclamation mark is shorthand notation for if you wrote this entire number out all the way from 1 all the way up to 1,312, or 1,312,000, by writing 1 times 2 times 3 times 4, etc., until you got all the way to times 100, or 1,312,000 even. So this is the total number of combinations of possible symbols in the library. That may not seem like it's an awful lot, but this number comes out to 10 to the 4,677th. Now that might not make anyone's eyebrows go up, but let's just put that in perspective. So this is the number of unique books in the library. That's the total number of possible books that are unlike anything else that is in the library. It's not infinite, and we'll get on to why the author may think, or the narrator, I shouldn't say the author, why the narrator of the story thinks that there is an infinite amount of books, even though this number is not actually endless. It's huge, monstrously big. And to understand how big that is, by comparison, all of the atoms, not things, not planets, all of the atoms, the small, minute particles that make up everything in the universe, in existence. The number of total atoms we think that currently exist in the observable universe is only 10 to the 81st. There are 2 more powers of magnitude of books in this library than there are atoms in the entire universe that we know of. That's a freaking ton of books. That's a lot. So that's not even, so the number of rooms in the library, it's practically the same number, because you have, to find the number of books in the library, you have, or number of rooms in the library, sorry. You take the number of books for each shelf, so it's 32 times 5 times 4, which I believe is 610, and you would divide that by 610, you get the number of rooms. This isn't gonna make a dent in that. It's just unbelievably big. I can't stress how huge this number is. Again, it's more of like things, not even just things, more than anything that's in the universe right now. This library, the Library of Babel, is incomprehensibly large. And I wanted to stress that because when you're looking, and there's so many things that are talking about, where characters and actions and events have taken place, when the narrator is mentioning all those people who have gone on pilgrimages or people who have gone in search of specific books, the visitations, which we'll get to in a second. This is the number that they're up against. The likelihood of them ever finding some of those books is 1 in 10 to the 4,677th. Which is not impossible, but it's so unlikely it's not even worth considering. But now that we have that out of the way, so an understanding of the space and things that's going on here, let's go ahead and take a look at the next aspect of this. So I also have our little yellow dot here because I've noticed over the past couple lectures that my writing pad tends to slide slowly down until it's completely out of frame. So that should help us at least remain in focus for a little bit longer. But anyway, so while it's a travelogue exploring this incomprehensibly large space, the next thing that the story is principally concerned with is a treatise. Now, what is a treatise? Now, a treatise is just simply a fancy word for like, hey, these are the ground, like we're gonna say stuff and this is what we're gonna abide by. It's just a metaphor, it's a declaration of facts on a certain topic. So what it's most often used for is things like philosophy or mathematics. Things that are much more abstract. There's things for like literary theory as well, but that's a little more give and take. But that's what usually it comes down to. And you can see that coming in when he uses words in the story like axioms and dictums, which are philosophical terms. But for the dictum, the first one that he talks about is how the library is a sphere with any given hexagon. Oh gosh, that's terrible. I'd practiced it so much. With any given hexagon equaling the center of it. Now, what exactly that means, that's more metaphysical and beside the point of what we're getting at, but that's what the dictum is. And the axioms that he's looking at, so we won't write out necessarily the axioms themselves, but an axiom is something you assume a priori. That before you begin debating or talking or discussing any points, an axiom is something like, okay, we're just gonna, this is true, and this is where we're gonna be arguing from. So it's just a given truth or fact on a topic. Like, we both agree that, like, this is true, like, we assume this to be true, and we are going to be working from this point onward. And the first ones that he uses in the story, we're looking at the ideas of that the library has existed ab Abiternate, actually, it's Latin. But it's a really fancy way of saying that it's always been around, it's always has been. No, it's been around infinitely, it always has been and always will be. It's just going to be here forever. It's a really fancy way of saying that. Alright, but the second one, which is that everything that's in all the books are only made up of the 25 symbols. Now, if you're like me and wondering, so just as a brief aside note, why this, because there's 27 letters in the alphabet, not including a period and a space, which he's also including this number. So why does he have 25? For any of you who are maybe confused about that, for Borges, what he did is he's eliminated some letters from the alphabet, things that make the same sounds. So for instance, there's only, I think, in his alphabet that he's referring to, there's only a K in it. There's not a C or a Q, because those make the same sounds most of the time. Some people disagree with that, but he's eliminated letters from the alphabet. So if you're wondering why there's only 25 when there should be 29 symbols, he's cut down a little bit. So if anyone was confused on that, Mark, that's what's going on. But these are the axioms, the given truths that the narrator assumes about the story. Now, why are we talking about all the philosophy and things that are going on here? Well, because we're trying to break this down, because it's a really strange story. Because it takes place in a weird world where, there's nothing but the library. Which is a strange scenario to think about. But one of the things that the story is trying to get at, or maybe make us consider as readers, is imagine if everything that you interacted with had text written on it. Text written all over it. So like every pillow, every book, like a book is a really dumb example, but like every couch or like door or a person that you encountered, everything had text written all over it. Every available space was covered with text. We couldn't help but try to figure out meaning of that, right? That if you encountered the random word baseball on a baseball, we would want to infer that there's some sort of significance from that, right? Because the word is correlating to whatever object it was found on. That the universe has then become linked to a system of meaning, and that's really abstract, so let's try to break that down for a second. All that's saying is if the entire universe was broken down into components that we found inherently meaningful, like if you pick up a book, you assume the book is about something. I don't think that's too far of an assumption to make. But if you have, 10 to the 4,677 books of every possible variation, and not all of them seem intelligible, we would try to assume that there's meaning nonetheless. And that's one of the things that's at the heart of the story, that is, they're trying to figure out. So what all of that is meaning to say is, if everything you looked at seemed to implicitly hold meaning or intent, that somebody had written it or created it, if everything looked like a book, what would that do? How would we react? How would we interpret that? And depending on your beliefs, thinking about, how the universe is made or not made, if things are intentional or not, this is kind of boiling that concept down to that idea. If everything looked like it had intent, how would we react? How would we go about interpreting things? Now in the story, they do have a sect of people, and the narrator disagrees with them. He calls them infidels in the story. but a group of people who assume, like, no, there is no actual meaning for any of the books. They're just a random assortment of letters, and we have attached a meaning to them, even though there is no implicit meaning in them. There is no meaning in the words that are in those books. The books contain no implicit meaning. We bring the meaning to them. Which is a weird concept to think about, right? You usually think, oh, you crack open a book and there's something that you have to read in there, but not all the time. I mean, if you didn't understand what the language was, or you didn't understand, if it was written in code, is another example, it may seem like gibberish, but there might in fact be intent hidden in there. Or, I don't know, if you throw letters up into the sky and they land on the ground, and they spelled out something that was accurate, nothing necessarily made it spelled out that way. It wasn't like you controlled the various trajectories and rotations of each of the pieces to make them land in a certain way to spell a certain thing. I mean, maybe you could have. I'm not that gifted with throwing Scrabble letters up in the air. But if I were to be the one who did that, I could not make it happen. So anything that those letters would possibly spell would be coincidental. And you'd have to question, how meaningful is it really? Does meaning come from intent, or does it come from what we bring to something? Is meaning implicit in a text, in all the books of the library, or is it something that the librarians have brought to it? Now that brings us to the other thing, because that kind of question, the considerations of if you're surrounded by a vast sea of what seems to be information, but might not in fact say anything, that brings us to the history component of what our narrator talks about a lot in the story. So for the history, there's a couple different things that go on, because the narrator gives a brief breakdown of something that's going to happen. The first one is, I swear to you guys, we'll get more lighthearted as we go on. I just have to find some good stuff. But the impetus for this story is the narrator begins with an N. The narrator is going to die. So on page 12, he talks about that. That's the reason he's writing this record down. It's like, I want to make an account of everything that I have seen and everything I have learned for anyone else who is interested. But there's also things like on page 114 where he mentions things that happen for many years. People held, like, he's giving a history of it, that many people thought, just as we just said here, that maybe the books have no meaning in and of themselves. But as time went on, and he mentions some like 500 years before he was around, they made one discovery that was for every book, every book is made of just those 25 symbols. And so everything that can be said with those has been said. And indeed, there are certain aspects of those that it comes down to the point that if the library contains only those things, then everything has simultaneously been said and unsaid. And if that sounds really confusing and contradictory, it's because it is. Because if this is the sum total of all information that can possibly exist, whether it's intentioned or meaningful or not, you can get books that are arguments, that's not how you spell it, but that's okay, arguments for something, and then you can equally get books that are just as powerful arguments against. And then you can get books that are refuting both of these things. Books that deny their own existence. Everything becomes possible in here. Just need to put exist dot. And it gets really confusing, and it becomes, something kind of disheartening for the character, for the narrator in the story. That he's even mentioning that when the outset of all this happens, it's on page 115, that when people first learned about that, everyone was happy because like, oh, we have the answers to everything. Everything that can be known has been written and put into the library somewhere. And regardless of how vast and intraversible it is for the human lifespan, that information does exist somewhere. And he talks about things like the visitations. So there's books that talk about things that have yet to happen, or things that have happened in the past but didn't make sense. These books will explain them. And the author claims to, or not the author, again, the narrator has said that has seen a couple of these themselves. The whole story revolves around the idea, again, that if everything that you saw implied that it had meaning, how would people react? And one of the things he gets at when he's talking about the history, especially towards the end, is the idea that people might not react well. People might react hopelessly. Because after everyone got excited about these, that for every meaningful book or seemingly meaningful book, there were thousands that were just words and letters on a page in totally random order, not meaning anything. That's what the story is doing with a lot of these things. For the history, for its aspect as a treatise, for what it's doing as a travelogue, and one person's attempt to make sense of the life that they have lived. It's a very introspective piece for all the things that they have seen and heard and on their last days that they're trying to deal with. One of the things is, if you enjoyed this story, for Borges, he's a big fan of labyrinths in his books and stories. So if you're interested in that, there's a whole plethora of other things. You can find a lot of his work online, like for this story, because he was back in like the 40s, I think, is around when this came on. There's a lot of stuff that's been influenced by his work. The last scene of Interstellar, when astronaut Cooper is bouncing around the Tesseract and nobody really knows what Nolan is trying to do there. That scene is inspired a lot by this story and a lot of Borges' work. But if you're curious about that, then I would highly encourage you to read this. But also, as another thing, and I will ask you guys to actually go and check this out, to find a shelf or a book in the library that you like, because this library actually exists. I don't mean in a physical sense, but because of the power of computing and of the internet. The Library of Babel is actually a website that you can go to, and it works just like this story. All 10 to the 4,677 books exist on that website, and you can go and read any of them. And it has a way to check that you can type in, I think. Alright guys, so the camera cut out unfortunately because my battery died. So we'll have to try to prevent that in the future. I'll just voice over for this last part, is I want you guys to go check out the Library of Babel online and find a book. And one of the lecture questions will ask you for the title and some other information about that, more details in the video lecture. But go check it out. But if you guys have any questions about anything that we talked about today, or any of the other lectures, or the readings for next week, or just stuff in general, you guys can always ask me. But until next time, I will simply say, I'll see you then.